So at the tail end of the planter is the closing tail. And this is just as important to get this right as it is the front. To check for proper alignment, we're going to begin by coming back to the closing tail and feeling for any side-to-side motion. If we feel an excessive amount of side-to-side motion like we see here, it's time to come up and pay attention to the bushings and the mounting holes of the actual closing tail itself. If necessary, replace these components. Once we have the closing tail tightly aligned, now we'll actually set the planter down on a pad of concrete, for instance, roll forward about 3 feet, and we'll scribe a line. We can then come behind and use that center line in the concrete to be sure that we're centered in the closing tail. If we're not, adjust the closing tail. Different closing systems will have different adjustments. In this case, we're going to loosen 2 nuts underneath, and we can pivot this tail side to side and then tighten it down to be sure that it's trailing properly. It's best to do this before we go to the field so that if we find something else outside that's a bigger issue, we can fix it in the shop as opposed to trying to do it without the proper tools. Now that we have the closing tail set and centered properly, we need to look at the distance between the closing wheels to assure that we're going to get the best closure of the trench that we can. So what we've done is we've set up the different extremes. Over here to the left side of the planter, we can see that we've set these too narrow. What we're measuring from is the bottom center radius to the bottom center radius. So when we measure here, this is set at about 1.5 inches between the two closing wheels. What this narrow setting will tend to do is pinch the top of the trench, but leave an air gap around the seed at the bottom, thus leaving a chance that will delay emergence. The other extreme is over here on the right side of the planter. These are set at 3.5 inches from bottom center to bottom center. This is going to tend to close towards the bottom of the trench, but we're not going to get the top of that trench closed. We're going to risk leaving an open furrow. In between, we've found is the optimal setting if we're planting in that 2 to 2.5 inch range. So if we look at 2.5 inches from bottom center to bottom center, this tends to center those forces down the edge of each sidewall and completely encapsulate that seed in the moisture beneath. Once we've determined that we have the proper distance set between our closing wheels, now we have to be able to determine whether or not we can maintain the right amount of pressure down to actually close the trench. To do this, in a shop setting, we can take a bathroom scale and slide it underneath each row unit. Put each closing tail in the same notch, in this case notch 1, and be sure that each spring is still healthy and applying the same amount of tension. If you see that you're getting a significant difference from row to row, it may be time to change out the springs on that closing tail to be sure that we can apply the right amount of force. Once we get to the field, then it's all about digging the cross section of the trench. You can use something like a pocket knife or a hand hoe to go in and cut across the cross section of the trench, pull it towards yourself, and assure that we've gotten rid of any air gaps around the seed without over closing the furrow.